to Thriving Together, Stories from CCEJ, a podcast from the California Conference for Equality and Justice. Our mission is to educate and empower youth and adults to lead change for equity and justice in our communities. I'm Daniel Solis, your host. For generations, CCEJ has brought groups of young people together from across Southern California for deep and heartfelt conversations about who they are, what they care most about, and what impact they want to make in the world around them. Nestled in the San Bernardino Mountains, thousands of high school students have taken part in our camp, at times called Anytown USA, Brotherhood Camp, Brotherhood Sisterhood Camp, and more recently, Building Bridges Camp. I'm also proud to share that I'm a camp alumni, 1999. In this episode, we are joined by Building Bridges Camp alumni, Taizin Barnhardt and Alisa Orduna. You'll hear as they talk about their camp experiences, decades apart, with the same message, to hold space for dialogue and community building. Let's listen.
Good morning. My name is Taizin. I am a camp alum and CCEJ volunteer currently, and today I'm joined by
Alisa Orduna, also a camp alum from when it was Big Brother, Big Sister.
I wanted to ask, which of CCEJ's values is guiding you in your life at this moment?
I would have to pick relationships, just because as we're coming out of the pandemic era where we were so isolated, that recognizing the value and importance of relationships, curiosity, in the second half of life, just always wanting to learn new technology and just new thinking and continuing to evolve our consciousness, so it keeps my brain going. And then the other one is imagination, just continuing to imagine the world that we really want and what are the possibilities that we're so limited on, particularly in these days of times where it just feels like the news is just always so heavy.
And I want to double down on imagination because that's very much a key aspect of the work that we do at CCJ, because we're trying to imagine a better world. To introduce yourself a little more, can you talk about what motivated you to attend Building Bridges Camp and your overall experience there?
Definitely. So I went to camp the first time in '86, so I know last century. And it was at the advice of an older cousin who was also an alumni. And at the time, in the mid-'80s, we were just starting the crack epidemic. There was a lot of gang violence that was starting to erupt around that. And there was just an opportunity to meet youth from across LA County. So back then I was in Pasadena, and literally youth from all over the county attended. So different high schools that may have been divided by the gangs, we were all in the same place. And it was a chance to get to know each other and build up our leadership skills so we can go back to our community and have the tools of how do we address some of the violence that was happening.
Prior to camp, did you have a lot of conversations about race or racial identity?
Just in my home, with my parents, and just making sure I had my own strong identity, but not so much in school. We had multicultural fairs where everyone brings kind of a food dish or a flag, but that's so surface level. It wasn't the deeper conversation. Mm-hmm. And see, at that time it was Big Brothers, Big Sisters. Mm-hmm. That was eye-opening. Yeah. The camp was very eye-opening.
How did camp address difficult conversations about race and racial identity, especially with strangers?
Yeah, I don't know how we create it. We talk about brave spaces now, particularly when we do dialogues. I'm not quite sure how we built that container because we were there for a week, but we dove right in. And I'll never forget on race, we did an actual racial pyramid, physical, where we broke into affinity groups, and each person or each group did their own assessment of the racial hierarchy. And then we went into the dining room, and those that were on top literally stood on the tables, and then others were in chairs, and some had the chairs turned backward. And so it was just such a stark, it was something you knew, but to see it and to embody it and experience, that will always sit with me. Same with gender. I remember anyone who identified as woman at that time, we walked through the group of folks that identified as male, and the males had to walk through the group of that identified as women and do catcalling, to talk about misogyny and just the fear that women have when we just walk down the street, and how you plan your day around safety. Those conversations, those are things you did, or maybe your mom may have told your auntie, but to talk about it so explicitly, and particularly embodying it through the exercises or experiences that have always stayed with me.
Mm-hmm. Was it hard for you personally to talk about those conversations, especially as a woman walking through a conversation with men or white people talking about blackness? How was that?
It was hard, but it was also a relief, like to have that space to be able to talk about it. And because you were supported, like either through the affinity group, through the staff, through the youth leaders who were volunteering with us, like I felt I could be honest for the first time and I could raise things and make mistakes. Like, there was just a lot going on back then. Like I remember the first year we talked a lot about HIV and we talked about the impact, on the LGBTQ community and what that was like. And mainly around, because there was so much stigma around people that were HIV positive. And so there were a couple of people that were HIV positive, so you just were able to have these very vulnerable conversations where you knew you were going to make mistakes because you're just learning for the first time. And there was grace to make the mistakes and to come out on the other side.
Yeah, it's amazing to talk to people that have gone through multiple generations of camps because the conversations that are there are so ever changing because it's always topical. Like recently we've been talking about like the recent Palestine-Israel conflict and knowing that it's like the AIDS pandemic and all those different conversations, and the conversation's always changing, but it's also always like progressive, which is awesome.
Which is awesome.
Have you brought any of these tools or learned experiences or skills that you learned at these camps to your everyday life? Especially, what's your work
Do
that
now?
you do
Yeah.
now?
So I worked in homeless services for the past 28 years. So starting off in direct staff, actually in Philadelphia, which I ended up there after graduate school, and then coming back home, LA's home. I would say, in fact, in college, I received a Herb Alford grant from CCEJ at that time. And it was around a project dealing with Black males and over the fear of so many Black males being incarcerated and dying. And so through that scholarship was able to do some work in my undergrad. So I think, early on it had an influence in directing my role around urban development and community building. We had different terms back then. And just the whole social justice framework, which I bring to everything, particularly working in homeless services, because homelessness is almost like our updated civil rights movement in the sense of disproportionality among African Americans, American Indians, Alaska Natives, women, people with disabilities, LGBTQ youth. Like there's so much disproportionality. And I remember asking, this is when I moved back from Philly and seeing so many Black faces like in Skid Row and downtown that were unhoused, and even in Venice and, other pockets of places, and saying, what happened? Because I kind of left, for college in 90. I wasn't here during the 92 urban unrest period. I knew there was a lot of movement after that and a lot of false promises. So to me, it was coming back and it was apocalyptic. Where I'm like, what happened to the Black community? Where the institutions, the anchors? And at that time, the response was, well, it's related to mass incarceration. And I'm like, well, that's not really an answer to homelessness. That's like another system failure. So what's driving this disproportionality? And I would have to say it was the training I received at camp that always developed that sensitivity and that courage to look at things and say, it's okay to talk about race. It's okay to talk about oppression and other forms of discrimination when we're looking at social problems, and not fall into kind of the white supremacist view of just looking at an individual and blaming the individual and saying, oh, it's their choice or they're just making bad choices, but taking the responsibility and saying, where as a society are we contributing to this culture and this like banishment of people from what we would call mainstream.
That brought up to me the idea that like there's this blame that Black people aren't like hardworking, or like there's this idea of the opposite, I guess, is the model minority myth, where everybody is perfect, and like if you're smart as an Asian person, you are smart only because you're Asian, and then very similarly, like you're poor because you're Black.
Yeah.
And I think that idea or the stigma that is the norm very much creates that divide.
Yeah, absolutely. To me, particularly when we went through it's always existed, but the awareness of like anti-Asian hate and just the awareness of the Asian American Pacific Islander communities that are out there and the diversity within those communities. Like, to me, I think the pandemic raised so much awareness because you're right, even the distribution of health services during that time for that community, people were looking at the model minority. Oh, that's they're fine. No
Yeah.
one's impacted by COVID, and and it was like, no, you have to disaggregate the data, like Southeast Asian, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islanders, Korean. Like you have to kind of break it down, and then also geography wise, and that was such an awareness raising, and then coupled with the violence that was happening to the Asian community. To me, I feel like there's now this opportunity. How do we come in dialogue with each other? How do we, as Audre Lorde says, don't fall into like the oppression Olympics, but how do we build up allyship and more understanding, particularly when you have just waves of groups that may have different history experiences. So like not everyone is tied to the Japanese internment, but those generations, the legacy generations, are going to have a different level or awareness than someone that hadn't had that experience. And so, like, how do we talk about racism within these cultural groups that are often pitted against each other?
It really reflects the idea that like Americans view all other continents as monoliths, as like all Asians are the same, all Black people or all Africans are poor and living in villages. And Europe, France, Germany, Britain, but it's like this small little area, but we know all the cultures. Do you think that you saw like a form of community when going to building bridges, like that first like had to hit this roadblock of like seeing that as reality and then breaking that reality?
Oh, definitely. I remember I was doing stats like for our football team in high school. And so, we travel across the county, particularly on the years that we were good and actually won. You kind of spread out of your community. And so I remember vividly playing Gardena High School, and a friend of mine was at Gardena, but we were different gang areas. And so I was like, I don't even know how we did it, but I just remember connecting with my colleague from camp, like under the bleachers, like, okay, we know we both can't be seen because we both would be in trouble, but how you doing? It's so good to see you. I don't know, we must have called or something, but I don't know, somehow we figured it out. And being able to navigate across borders that were imposed either socially, economically, race, was empowering. And then later we were called in, as this was through the youth leadership part, to some of the schools in San Gabriel Valley where there were tensions between the Latinx and the Asian gangs and communities there. And so we were brought in to do mediation. And so it's like youth talking to youth saying, don't fall into, these cultures that want to see us divided. It's more about allyship and how do we build solidarity? How do we build understanding? How do we not fall into that trap of there's limited resources, so we have to like fight each other over being seen and being heard and being validated. And to be able to do that with NCCJ, Building Bridges was super, super amazing.
Something you just said was crossing borders, but that they're all social. Or in my mind, it became like this political idea that we think that between different countries, like there's this physical line, or just like...
Yeah. Well, what Building Bridges, the camp taught me was that borders are socially constructed.
Yeah.
Like they're not these hard lines, and that somehow we receive messaging even as youth around like gang lines or community lines or things like that. And camp gave me permission and tools to see the world to build bridges, because the social constructions in so many mindsets, but to not see the world that way. And so that there was a new courage or going back to imagination of just saying, this isn't real, so let me imagine, what it would be like to cross that border.
The idea that struck with me is that you said that you were a part of a youth program that talked to other youth and try to dissolve this idea that we don't want to dissolve the idea of falling into these like mainstream habits of like political divide, social divide. Do you think that those youth programs are more helpful than when like an adult comes into a room and says, hey, don't do this?
I do. I mean, I feel bad because I'm in the adult world now and I love talking to young people, but I do think it's more impactful when it comes from youth. And part of it is that, each generation is building its own future, like building the future for the futures that will come after you. And I think it's important that how you make meaning and how you interpret and how do you bring people together around the kind of vision that you want, I think is so huge. Like I look at over the past, let's just say decade, the increase in awareness of gender identity, increase in awareness around climate change, the increase in awareness around the impact of colonization and neo-colonization that continues to happen, and we're seeing it play out in Palestine. Like all of that is the two generations
Youth-led.
after me. It's youth-led, and it's like, how do we get out, make sure we get out of the way? I would say being a Gen X, like sometimes we're a little salty because baby boomers didn't do that. Like they were so progressive, and then it's like, and our myth of generational narrative is like they were so progressive, they fought against Vietnam War and civil rights, but then they started making money and then they became the oppressor, and they didn't get out of the way in the workplace. They didn't believe in mentorship and supporting of the youth voices. So it felt like there was always this conflict between generations, and I'm hoping that's changing. And I'm hoping that we see youth leadership as part of the like if the nation was a teenager or had its like own life, its own sovereignty as a being, that we see that that's just part of the life cycle. And so how do we do more intergenerational work, but it's in different roles where we're supportive, we can share lessons, we can, use whatever wisdom we gathered around like making sure you have strategy, or amplifying the ideas, that come out, or having the resources and putting the resources behind it. But yeah, I think I'm just so proud of like your generation and the generation before and after. And I just hope that we begin to listen. Like it pains me all the effort around, I know we talked briefly like about Gaza and the situation in Palestine, and to see so many recent, particularly youth really putting themselves on the line, on college campuses across the country. And initially when the president said, yeah, that's not going to change anything. I'm like, how can you be so dismissive? Like, even if there's truth in that, why can't there be some openness to listen and say, well, maybe I need to think of this in a different way? Or maybe I at least need to have dialogue with youth to understand what is passion, what's feeding this passion. And like, I'm thankful for spaces like CCEJ where that could happen, but it's also how do we leverage that energy, that framework, that perspective at a national level so we can impact national policy, and that youth aren't just looked at, oh, that's just, your rite of passage of where you're trying to find your voice. But no, that voice has some meaning behind it and some wisdom in it. And so how do we better honor that?
Very much history repeats. And I think it's funny that we're in a time right now where like history is trying to be very overtly like shielded or like changed or like shown very specifically that's not 100% truthful. And like I remember seeing the videos of Hamilton Hall in Columbia where they did a protest as well for Vietnam War, and it's beautiful to see history repeat, but also scary and like sad. Speaking of hate in our community, CCEJ is part of several coalitions to prevent hate, including LA versus Hate and Stop Hate California. Do you know anyone who's been impacted by hate personally or hate speech?
Yeah, on so many different levels, from microaggressions to overt. Particularly when I'm working with the unhoused community. I'll never forget, I was on a panel at the Museum of Tolerance, and we were talking about solutions of how do we address the unhoused crisis. And someone said, well, why don't we just put them on a train and send them to San Bernardino? And I just said, whoa, wait a minute. Look where we're at. Like, we could just walk out of this room and look at the poster boards of the history of what happened, during the Holocaust, and this idea that a group of people so dehumanized and unfit and unworthy to be in society that we're just going to put them on a train and relocate them as if they have no family ties, as if they're not connected to community, as if because they're unhoused or living in a tent, as if that's not their home. And that, so like there's just this piece on a chess table or something that could be moved, a game piece that could be moved around. And oftentimes, like hearing that kind of speech, the deep othering, I've even had, when I worked for City of Santa Monica, was over their homelessness, like letters of like, they're like roaches. Why do we care? You know, and just when you go back to the Holocaust, the Rwanda genocide, like other major genocides and extermination programs, you see I don't want to say the skills, but the tactics that people use to other. And I see that far too often with our in-house community in particular.
How have your experiences with NCCJ or CCJ influenced how you respond to acts of hate or help others to respond?
Being an active witness, like not being quiet. You know, there's different ways you can bystand to help. And so, if it's a small, like you're in the store and you see someone being rude to someone else or a clerk person being rude, like sometimes I'll just intervene and say, hey, to the person, like, are you okay? Do you need support? You know, or if it's like a store employee being rude, saying, that's not cool, where's the manager? You know, so not being afraid to intervene to larger pieces where reading a news story and saying, how do we reach out to that family just to say, I see you, I heard you, I'm sorry this happened to you. Or putting it on the line, you know, either writing to Congress to, you know, with the situation in Palestine, writing to all the senators and to the president, taking some social direct actions. Particularly, I remember there was one where it was kind of youth-led. It was pretty risky, but it was like, okay, but you've done things like this before, so go and be that, at least show up in support to witness with them, you know? And so I think witness we think of as passive, and I think it's actually an action piece to it. And it doesn't mean you take away agency from someone that's going through the experience, and that's why it's always like, are you okay? Do you need support? Or like, I see you, is there anything I can do? Because we also want people like to feel supported, but also to feel empowered and not let those acts of hate make you feel less than or make you feel that you did something wrong, or, you know, because we internalize so much oppression and we eat it and we think it's a part of who we are. And it's like, no, that person's projecting a whole lot of stuff. And I'm just going to put up my armor and reflect it back to you. It's not going to touch me, but not, you know, it's like, so you never know who has that skill set or that mindset yet. And so you always want to support people and not just, because you can fall into saviorism too. And that's not helpful for people.
What are some actions that our listeners can take to promote racial justice in their everyday lives or at their work or their schools?
I think particularly in schools and in work, and it's funny because I'm not a data person, but I am a data person in a way of looking at outcomes. Become aware of how is oppression showing up in your various ecosystems. In your family, is there anti-Black hate, anti-Asian hate, anti-Latinx, anti-gay, anti-trans hate, you know, transphobia, Islamic, like, don't be afraid to have those conversations and understand and try to raise awareness to, in the workplace or the schools, who's graduating and who's not. You know, why did my freshman class look one way and the graduating class look different? You know, what supports are we giving to people? Are people falling out by various identities that aren't being supported? And same in the workplace, whatever it is that you are, I always tell my students, I teach a social justice class at USC, and it's in public policy. And I always say, do the history of the policy or the sector that you're working in. So if it's social work, homelessness, criminal justice, understand what were those policies that created this sector, because often there's some form of bias in that is leading to the disproportionality. And so own that, be aware of that, and then fight to kind of change and modify the harm that policies and the systems that they create are actually causing. So it means get involved. You can't just show up. We can't just say, oh, you know, work is separated than who I am, or this belief. Like, we cannot continue to silo the parts of ourselves, and we have to have the courage to bring in our authentic selves into multiple situations, which almost organically will lead to our action in a different way when we're really tapped into the source of our own power and not fear.
You teach a class at USC?
It's a graduate seminar in social justice in the Price School of Public Policy, which is really interesting because it's the only class where we we talk about social justice in the master's program.
Really?
So my students kind of come in like, the world is, I flash my hands like headlights, because it's just, when you talk about like economics or you talk about policy from like a quantitative or like theory perspective, and then I try to bring in the humanist, you know, of the policies and understanding how do you work with communities that are most closely impacted, and how do you develop that awareness so you don't have the arrogance that has led to some bad policy making.
When you said look at the outcomes as someone who's looking for actions to take. And I remember reading that some interviews, when they're looking at prospective employees that are women, they'll ask questions differently than men in ways that ask them for like, how are they going to keep the people that we have, or like our clients? And then for men, like, how are you going to improve us? And there was many other examples of like this difference between how we interview people or how we view gender in that way. Do you think that that can be taken into account when looking at outcomes? Particularly the idea that we look at like causality through race or gender as like they're not good enough because they answered this way, but not necessarily how are we viewing them based on like our own stereotypes or stigmas prior to like even assessing them.
Yeah, no, totally think that's still a bias that happens. And you see it also playing out in pay and compensation, that there's such a huge disparity among gender. And then, of course, you could break that down by race and gender. And I think it's two ways, too, because it's also how we're socially conditioned to show up for interviews, like just generally speaking. But I see it in my own life. So maybe I'll just use I statements that there's so many positions and opportunities out there that I was either waiting for someone to come and tap me and say, hey, I think you would be good at this, or showing up and saying, you know what, I don't quite have all the skills on the job description. I'm not going to apply for it. Where I remember there was a situation where we were looking at something and a male colleague's like, oh, I'm applying for it. It's like, wait, I have more skills in this than you do. How are you applying for it? But so I think, it comes to understanding our own power and empowerment and how we show up. So more data to read on those gender disparities, particularly in the interviewing process, even around salary negotiation. And then I do think there's still bias on the employer side. And I think that, okay, put it, when I was coming up, it was like as a woman, you almost took on what you thought of as masculinity as a mask to show up. And that led to some very, particularly in the nonprofit sector, to me, has led to some very toxic work environments where we talk about trauma-informed, but it's not in practice among our own employees and how we treat each other and promotional opportunities and all of that. So I guess it's not emerging, but it's out there, emerging practice of psychologically safe work culture environments. And it's with intention that how do we create an environment that is going to be inclusive for the majority of people, and where people really feel safe to bring up their ideas and their contributions and their authentic selves, and not kind of this assimilated version of ourselves. And so I think, again, I'm hoping I hope we went through COVID for a reason, and all the racial reckoning and gender awareness, and even going through what we're going through now. I hope there's some change in society, and I hope it is around this greater buy-in to be more inclusive and more cultures of belonging than our default of segregation and assimilation into like one kind of nondescript culture, that we celebrate. We're able to have workplaces and environments that celebrate our diversity. And so if someone answers the question different than how we thought the answer should be, we look at that as a strength. Like, wow, I would have never had that perspective. That could really bring value to the workplace, because that's clearly a blind spot that we've had versus so holding on to like hoarding ideas. I think that keeps us stagnant, and that keeps us fighting and keeps us divided. And so I'm hoping we're on the cusp of some kind of paradigm shift.
We talked about how history repeats, and thinking about our final question, I was going to ask, do you think that there's a possibility for, as well as what would it look like to feel like when we live in a world free of oppression?
Oh, I think it's always a possibility. It may not be at a macro level, but I think inside of our intentional communities that we can create, if it's 1 week at camp or a weekend at camp or a reunion event, or just gathering with friends, or the neighborhoods that we live in, or the schools or work environments, I think there's definitely opportunity to create kind of oppressive-free zones, if you will. And if we were able to like really build and leverage that, I think we're going to have to go through some conflict first. And I think of that, there was this woman who it was like a New Year's Eve church service, but she was the guest speaker, and she talked about laboring in a new paradigm, and like the process of labor, of how you go through so much pain to have rebirth or to have new birth. And so I feel like we're going to go through moments of greater tension and greater conflict. It's because we're wrestling with these larger philosophical ideas about the world that we want. And I think as we get through that, a world that would be without oppression would just be vibrant and thriving, because we wouldn't be extracting from the earth, and the earth would be able to reproduce in the way. Like, the waterways would be clear. We would be able to preserve so much more in the natural environment, which will then bring us at peace as humans. Because I think as our earth is impacted, I think there's a collective grief and depression that we're all experiencing on top, and that could be acting out through wars or the violent acts that we have, or the increase in deaths by suicides that we're seeing. Like, all of those things I think will change, because I think we'll have a healthier environment. We'll be in better relationship with the earth and with each other. You know, I think about how in the old days, you know, people lived easily into their hundreds. Like, I think we don't need all this technology and medication. We just need real fruit, real vegetables, and fresh water, and clean air, and hugs, and, you know, positive relationships. So I think people living longer, the earth thriving, and us just really using our brilliant minds. Like, having the time to really, I don't know, find the cures for cancer, or, you know, whatever it is. Like, I just see us being, I think of going, when I say the older, like, I think about Timbuktu and like some of those early found, like, how did they look at stars without telescopes? And how did they notice like this eclipse, and, you know, the various natural cycles, like being so much in touch with kind of like an earth-based rhythm, that it would just be a different place.
For me, I feel like the initial thing that came up to my mind is the idea that no one's better than anyone else. And I think Americans have this very individualistic idea that we are number one, which I think we're amazing. But I think that the rest of the world is as well. And once we're able to view everyone as a community, like every country and every local community as something that we want to help rather than compete with, I think is where I will feel like it is free of oppression, because we're all trying to help one another.
I love that. I love that vision.
Yeah. Thank you so much for your
thank
time here. Thank you, CCEJ, for having me as host today. And thank you, Alisa, for coming. I had an amazing time talking to you.
My pleasure. My pleasure. And I want, please stay in touch. I want to hear all what you're going to do to change the world.
Thank you so much to Taizin and Alisa for sharing their camp stories. Spaces to engage in dialogue, like camp, are crucial in preventing the spread of hate by building real relationships and understanding across differences. If you're interested in learning more about CCEJ's Building Bridges programs, visit our website at cacej.org/building-bridges. Once again, I'm Daniel Solis, and don't forget to subscribe to our podcast to hear more stories of thriving together. CCEJ's podcast is sponsored in part by LA vs. Hate.